Um, yeah, so we'll start our last panel now for this year's summit. So discussing disaster resilience, the panel will address the intrinsic relationship between water and climate change, with experts focused on predictive tools and improved response systems. The panel will explore how we can take a more proactive stance in shifting climate trends and disasters. So our moderator today is Deborah Campbell, who's a senior staff member of the MIT Lincoln Lab. And I'd like to remind everyone that the Q&A will be open throughout the panel. So please post your questions through the Q&A function and definitely respond to some of the questions that the panelists will pose in there too. And so now I'll pass it off to you, Deb.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Deb Campbell. I'm a senior staff scientist in MI Lincoln Laboratories Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Group, and I lead the laboratory's climate change initiative. I'm very happy to be here with you all today as the moderator for the disaster resilience panel. Climate change is one of the most urgent threats facing human civilization to date. The impacts of rising sea levels, more frequent and intense storms, heat waves and droughts, and changing water availability are compounded by our population growth, where we live, and land use practices. More than 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. As the world's population grows, we are facing an increase in urbanization, including in coastal cities. More than 50% of the world's population now lives in urban areas, and this is expected to increase to 70% by 2050. We're also facing extreme events, including floods and droughts that are already significantly impacting the food supply in some parts of the world. These impacts do not affect everyone equally. Developing countries and disadvantaged groups within all countries are much more vulnerable and have the fewest resources to address these challenges. Climate modeling, impact forecasting, proactive adaptation strategies, and stakeholder engagement are all important to improving our disaster resilience. Today, we will touch on some of these pillars of disaster resilience, including proactive prevention and mitigation measures, preparedness, including early warning systems, and recovery, including building back better. We are very fortunate to have 4 great panelists with us today who lead important disaster resilience efforts around the world and will share their experiences and expertise as we look to a more proactive resilience strategy for the future. I'd like to welcome Pamela Silva Diaz, Dave Groves, Chris Funk, and Anita Von Breda, and let each of the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Pamela, then Dave, then Chris, and then Anita. Welcome. And I think Laura is bringing up, yep.
Hello, everybody. My name is Pamela Silva Diaz. I'm based in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I was part of the humanitarian response after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017. And I've been working on community resilience efforts in Puerto Rico ever since. Hurricane Maria left thousands of families without power and also without water. And months after Hurricane Maria, there were communities that were still without running water in their homes. So with organizations like Oxfam America, MIT Lab, and University of Puerto Rico, I've been able to study what are some of the main challenges regarding water, sanitation, and hygiene for some of the most vulnerable populations in Puerto Rico. And this includes rural communities, it includes women, the elderly, and disabled community members. So understanding this, we've been able to focus on preparedness for community-led emergency response and community resilience and climate change adaptation. And for example, we've been able to lead trainings and workshops for what, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. So we've been able to lead trainings and workshops for off-grid water testing, for example. And I think you see a picture over here. This is an example of a community member taking a water sample from a place where his community actually received water and they used it for consumption. So we were able to leave that type of training and also building low-cost water treatment solutions, affordable water treatment solutions with communities. And also workshops for building low-cost technologies that can help address some of these challenges. So for example, do-it-yourself washing machines or hand washing stations that can be made with locally available materials, things that you can get from hardware shops, and other innovations that can be made locally. And just recently, a couple of partners and I held a virtual workshop where community members were able to design their own solutions to strengthen community resilience and address some of the challenges that happen after disasters and emergencies. So especially for remote communities, sometimes community members are their own first responders. So it's really important that we harness the leadership, the creativity, and the innovation of these community members. And that way we can really support the disaster risk reduction and the climate change adaptation and the climate resilience in these vulnerable communities. So that's a little bit about my experience, and I'm really happy to be here with you and the other panelists, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
So I think we're switching to Dave's slide next.
Yep. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is David Groves. I'm a, next slide, please. I'm a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Just a little background, RAND is a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy research organization, and we do work pretty much across all public policy areas, but my focus is really on climate adaptation and resilience planning. I put a couple links up here if you're interested in more understanding more. I co-direct our Center on Climate Resilience, and at that link there, there's you can learn more about the kinds of work that we do at RAND, which may interest particularly some of the students in this group. And also I co-direct the Center on Decision Making Under Uncertainty. And lastly, I am one of the many professors at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, which is a PhD program in policy analysis in Santa Monica at RAND headquarters. It's a very interesting program for those of you who might be interested in pursuing a doctorate in policy analysis, so you can definitely check it out there. So with relationship to the topic today, let me just say a little bit about the kind of work that I do. I'm much more on the research and planning side of disaster resilience. I do a lot of work with government agencies or organizations on helping them think through how to develop strategies or plans for climate adaptation as well as disaster recovery. I've recently done a lot of work in coastal Louisiana, helping them develop a priorities and for their $50 billion coastal master plan. This is a plan that gets updated every 5 years, and we've been working with them since the 2012 plan. I've also worked some post Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico issues. I was part of a team that helped the government come up with a economic and disaster recovery plan following that catastrophic hurricane year. And I also do work on decarbonization. One point that I wanted to highlight is that I think for these topics, and when you think about disaster planning and resilience, we have to think about it in the context of a changing planet, as what Deb mentioned earlier. And one of the challenges in doing so is that if the planet is changing, that means the threat is changing, or the hazards and the threats are changing, and so that poses a challenge for thinking about, well, how do we prioritize investments in resilience, or how do we know how far to go, or where we should focus our resources. There is a growing field to support this kind of decision making called decision making under deep uncertainty. We just actually had our annual meeting virtually this week, and you can learn all about it at www.deepuncertainty.org. But this is a great community that's trying to think or trying to bring new techniques for thinking about climate change and other really broad uncertainties and bring that into the planning. So really quickly, I just have a couple questions just to make this a little bit more lively. Next slide, please. So just to kind of get people's sense of how volatile this year has been. Does anybody know how many hurricanes have made landfall in the US during the 2020 season and what the previous record was? When I was looking this up, I was just amazed by this. So the answer is, there are 29 named storms and 12 made landfall this year. And this broke the record of 9, which was set in 1916. So we're definitely dealing with a tremendous amount of, an awful lot of activity and disasters this year. Next slide. Another interesting statistic is what percentage of area of California was on fire in 2020. I think maybe some people have heard this statistic quoted, but I just did a quick calculation, and it was about 4% of California was on fire at some point in 2020. So we're clearly dealing with a lot of challenges. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to the next panelist.
Thanks for that great introduction, David. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I didn't prepare slides. I thought I would just talk. So I'll introduce myself, and then I have a question for everybody. My name is Chris Funk. I'm a research professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I direct the Climate Hazard Center. That's chc.ucsb.edu. And for more than 20 years, I've worked really closely with the U.S. Agency for International Development's Famine Early Warning Systems Network, or FuseNet. And I do a lot of research into precipitation, climate variability, drought early warning systems, and food security. And I also am really heavily engaged in operational drought early warning to support famine prevention. And so I kind of span, I'm kind of pretty much in the trenches, helping to move, billions of dollars of food aid to 100 million people, but also, engaged in kind of basic research and applied research. And our Climate Hazard Center here is really unique in that we have a set of research scientists who are engaging in studying these topics, programmers producing rainfall data sets and forecasts, and then also a set of field scientists who are stationed in Addis Ababa, Gaborone, Botswana, Kenya, Niamey in Niger, and Guatemala. And so we have a really cool kind of back and forth system where we engage with them to develop early warning science, but also to push that information out into a lot of developing countries and kind of get it in people's hands. And so, that position has really given me a really pretty unique understanding of how climate change is really impacting a lot of countries right now, increasing food insecurity. And so, it's probably worth thinking about that just a little bit. And I think at present, our best estimates of the number of really food insecure people, so that's people who need humanitarian assistance or could face the risk of death, is like 100 million people. Going to bed facing massive need for food aid. But at the same time, I think you can really think about famine early warning systems, of which I'm just one small piece, is being, really an incredibly successful example of how we can build resilience. And so even as the number of food insecure people has really increased and it may double in the next year due to COVID, we are managing to really prevent famine in a kind of really widespread way. So, so our efforts can be successful. But then, kind of at the same time, I just see in my day-to-day job, how, an increasingly frequent flood events have led to displacements in East Africa, Central America, supported outbreak of desert locusts that are ravaging Kenya and Ethiopia and Somalia. And then at the same time, those are often interspersed with more severe droughts. And so these are really impacting, millions of people. But there's a lot that we can do to, provide early warning. And, kind of today, with the theme of this summit being water, we think in our group a lot about information services, being like a utility that we can push back out. And so institutes like MIT or the University of California, can develop data sets and forecasts, and then those can flow, through the internet and pop up in places like Malawi or Kenya, And so the cool thing that happened this week was that they took some of our weather forecasts produced here, and those were shown to Kenyan farmers over television. And with a way that, so this information can flow, from these sort of ivory towers back out and hopefully improve resilience. That's what I work on. Oh, but my question for the audience is, what is the one simple physical principle that will almost certainly or absolutely certainly increase the intensity of droughts, floods, and fires? And the answer is that as the atmosphere warms, it can absolutely hold more water, right? This is not something that we, have to model. We just know that, when you warm the atmosphere, that the molecules move further apart, the atmosphere holds more water. And so that physical principle can increase the amount of rainfall that we get during extreme rainfall events. But then in, under dry weather, that absorbs more moisture from the ground, setting up conditions for more severe droughts and fires like we're unfortunately experiencing in California. So, it's coming and it's already here.
Thanks, Chris. We'll finish with Anita, please.
Thanks, Deb. My name's Anita Van Breda, and I work, my job is Senior Director for Environment and Disaster Management at World Wildlife Fund, or WWF, in Washington, D.C., and that is part of our adaptation and resilience team. And I started working on disasters in 2005 after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And at that time, when I would walk into a Red Cross office, someone would either give me a blank stare or look at my business card, see a panda logo on it, and say, "Why are you here? What does this have to do with the environment?" And it turns out the answer is the environment has a lot to do with disasters. So I think in order to be proactive and less reactive, we need to understand that risk comes from multiple and cumulative driving factors. And therefore we need to attack that risk from multiple vantage points. So for example, a healthy and a functioning ecosystem can reduce people's vulnerability to extreme events. And therefore the other side of the coin is that a degraded and polluted ecosystem increases people's vulnerability to extreme events. And so we now know that disaster risk is a factor of hazards and vulnerability. So there really is no such thing, for example, as a natural disaster. There are natural hazards like floods and storms and hurricanes the disaster happens when that hazard meets a vulnerable community, a community that's not well placed to cope with that extreme events. So there are clear linkages then between the health and the degradation of the environment and disasters. And yet in the professional disaster management space, environmental issues are, in my view, insufficiently addressed from a policy, practice, and learning perspective. And although I've seen a lot of progress on this issue since 2005, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think everybody in this room, all the participants as well as the panelists, can do something to advance that challenge. So in the environment and disaster management program that I lead at WWF, we're focused quite a bit on building the capacity and training environmentalists to be a positive factor in disaster management, to be able to work successfully with humanitarians, for example, on conducting assessments, on developing new tools and techniques that reduce, if not eliminate, the negative environmental impacts or footprints, for example, of disaster response programs like rebuilding shelter, rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding water and sanitation systems, and being able to do that in a way that is climate informed, more resilient for the future, and minimizes environmental footprint. And then using on the front end to reduce disaster risk, using nature like our natural and nature-based flood management program. So we're very committed to training the next generation of practitioners and to help folks learn at the front end of their careers, for example, how to look at things from multiple disciplines and perspectives. And that means getting biologists, engineers, planners, data scientists, artists, communicators together in order to be able to understand each other's worldview, the language that we use, and the perspectives that we have. And so partnerships with academic institutions and interns and internships are very important to our program. I'm grateful to MIT and to Deb and Laura for facilitating this conversation and for bringing the panelists together. And I look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anita. Those were all wonderful introductions and gave us a really nice feel for the important work that you're doing, and really set a great stage for some of the questions that I have, and I'm sure you have for each other as well. And I can see audience questions coming in too, so that's really exciting. So Chris, the first question's for you, but again, anyone else should feel free to add comments or jump in when they feel that they would like to. What are our current forecasting modeling capabilities with respect to climate change and weather extremes? And how have these capabilities prepared us to be more resilient with respect to droughts and floods, and where are they failing us? And what improvements are needed to address these gaps and failures? And, I think some of the challenges are coming from, this being a dynamic environment that we're working in, along the lines of what David touched on.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Deb. I prepared some notes a little bit on these too. And so, I mean, I think the first thing is to realize that, over the past 20 years, we've really made pretty amazing advances in our ability to model and monitor, our climate and weather. And, it's really, I think, one of the great collective achievements of humanity, and it's been in a really distributed way. So you have, for example, modeling groups all over the world, kind of, breaking up the world into different pieces and modeling those independent systems. You might model the land surface, you might model a cloud, you might model the ocean, and then you fit those pieces together and have the current generation of kind of integrated models that are pretty amazing. And then at the same time, we have this incredible at least on in the developing world, and there's a huge opportunity there. But technically, I think at the weather time scale, we have a pretty incredible capability. But as you go further out in time, right, you get more and more problems. And, at the climate time scale, we have a lot less skill. And then when you get to the kind of climate change perspective, things become even kind of more uncertain. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, and I'm a big advocate of, and we kind of develop here at Santa Barbara, are strategies for utilizing multiple sources of information in kind of a staged way. So, for example, I do a lot of work in East Africa, which is incredibly food insecure. We saw more than 250,000 people die in Somalia in 2011, unfortunately, due to consecutive droughts. And what we've done to support famine early warning is develop these kind of staged systems. And so at a very, very long lead, we can kind of look at climate change issues, and we've noticed that it's getting drier during the springtime there. And so that kind of, sets the stage for us. But then, I think it's really important that we intellectually kind of jettison this idea of climate change as just being this trend, right? That it's just, it's going to get a little bit warmer every year, and that's going to be climate change. Because what we're experiencing really is more extreme weather and more extreme climate events. So our work has shown that, and the work of many other scientists have shown that, probably things like El Niños and La Niñas, which are associated with really warm waters in the eastern and the western Pacific, right, are driving more extreme climate. And so right now, the work that we're doing is we're seeing that set up in a La Nina pattern with really cool waters in the east and cool waters in the west. And so we're making kind of very long lead projections of dry conditions in East Africa. But then as we get into those seasons, those are very long lead, but very uncertain. But then as we get closer in, we can use things like the weather forecasts that are really high resolution and accurate. And then as we get into the growing season, we can use satellite observations of rainfall and vegetation. And then finally, at the end of the season, we can really drill in with this sort of high resolution kind of satellite imagery that you might have seen in, on Google Earth, and really get a detailed picture. So we have these telescoping systems that fit together all the different information sources. And that's great, but, I think that the biggest hurdle that we're facing right now, is what we call the last mile, right? It's like we have all this computational power, we have all this satellite information, and it's just sitting on disk somewhere, and it's not really getting out, into the hands of the farmers so that they can, decrease poverty, increase their resilience, and, improve their lives. So to me, it's more of a social engineering issue than it is like a technical thing. And, for me, as I've grown as a scientist, I take much more seriously now the sort of outreach component of what I do. 10 years ago, I would just write my paper, put my data on an FTP site, and I was done. And that's not going to be enough in the coming decades. So it's great that, forums like this where we can talk about these issues in a way that gets beyond the ivory tower, I think is really important. Thanks.
That's a Fantastic high-level overview, and it's great that you brought up the synergy of the satellite data as well as the modeling, and how this information can be used on different timescales to inform being proactive. The other capability I'm aware of that's being developed that starts to touch on some of what you talked about with outreach is the NASA Severe effort, trying to get some information in the hands of the farmers, but there's so much more to be done.
Yeah, we have 2 severe projects going on at our center right now.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. That's the NASA Severe, the NASA Harvest project is another one. Yeah. We're big supporters of those.
Oh, that's great. And David, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say this might be a nice time to just sort of expand a little bit, or just highlight that I think there's a variety of different timescales that we talk about or need to think about when we're considering disaster resilience. So, you asked about our ability to, understand or predict the weather and predict, when disasters might strike, and absolutely, Chris laid out a lot of great information about the progress that's being made there, and also the challenges in using some of that real-time data to enable farmers in certain areas to know what's coming and respond appropriately. But I just I think it's important to recognize that there are certainly the decisions that are made in the run up to a potential disaster, and information to inform that decision making is getting much better as we have better forecasts, et cetera. But we still have this overarching challenge of trying to understand, how should we be making different decisions in how we construct our society and build our infrastructure to be more resilient when on longer timescales, it's really hard to know exactly how the climate is changing and how that will manifest itself in terms of changing hazards. And I think everybody I've talked to has been surprised at the extent to which fire hazard has just acutely exploded over the last several years. I mean, yes, theory has predicted that this would happen for many of the reasons that Chris outlined nicely in his intro, but just understanding sort of where the discontinuities are, or where the thresholds are that can be crossed to the point where now you're not just dealing with a couple of extra fires, but now you're looking at 5% of a state being on fire. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that, and there are some. So I think the challenges for longer term decision making about where to invest resilience funds must do so with an eye towards or being humble about us being able to really know how the threats are going to be evolving in the future.
Thank you. Anita?
I just wanted to pick up on that a little bit. I think that I find it kind of interesting that, at a personal level, all of us as individuals, I think we go through life making decisions without all the information that we need, right? You might choose to go to a university or a college thinking you're going to get a degree in a program and have a professional career. You don't really know that for sure. You start dating somebody new, you don't know if that's going to be your life partner, right? We have to make decisions all the time without full certainty. So I applaud my panelists here, and I appreciate the work that they do in helping us reduce that uncertainty. But I think the uncertainty that is just present at some level in life also makes a pretty strong case for diligent attention to adaptation. And I think part of the benefit that we get from using, for example, natural and nature-based methods in flood management is the adaptability that you can build into a system that a hard or gray engineering is not well placed to provide. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out as food for thought. Thanks.
Yeah, and I maybe just one quick comment, Deb, and then you can move on. Just to kind of follow up on Anita and David's points, is that short-term adaptation through early warning responses, right? Maybe can address the problems in the short term, but could also support long-term maladaptation, right? So in the area that I work the most, East Africa, you're seeing both expanding populations that are increasingly farming in kind of marginal drier areas as population pressure increases. And then you have, land degradation and, a lot more livestock living on, land that's, becoming eroded and less capable of supporting, ecosystem services. And so, I may be helping to win the, win a battle on the short term, but that may be losing in the long term. So there's some trade-offs here too.
Yeah.
Those are really important points. This is so nuanced, and there's so much to think about as you and who is advantaged or perhaps even disadvantaged by some of the things that we're doing and what those trade-offs are. So I'd like to touch on a couple more questions, and David, I think you already touched some on the question that I had for you on making decision and thinking about near term and more far term given uncertainty. And so I'm curious in the context of that and your area of expertise, if you could touch a bit on how you think about the Louisiana coast and disaster recovery and building back better versus possibly having to think about relocating with respect to near and longer term climate change impacts, and how you are able to help people think about those difficult kinds of questions, both community and government.
Sure, thanks. That's I guess there's a lot of angles that I could attack that question but let me maybe just say a little bit briefly about how I've been working in the coast. So after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the Louisiana government began a 5-yearly master plan cycle, and the objective of this was to come up with a comprehensive approach to investing large amounts of resources into sort of the dual purpose or the dual objectives of helping help stabilize the landscape, coastal Louisiana, for a variety of reasons. The vast wetland areas at the interface between the land and the water is going away at an alarming rate. Part of that is sea level rise and subsidence. Part of it is human activity, et cetera. But the point is that's protective buffer of the landscape is being lost, which poses or increases the risk to people and structures and the built infrastructure, as well as reduces some of the ecosystem services that the land provides. And so in this process, we're looking out 50 years. We're talking about billions of dollars of investment, and we need to grapple with these questions of, well, how should we make choices among supporting different types of aspects of the coast, whether it's a particular fishery or a landscape in an area adjacent to some town, et cetera. And then how do we think about ensuring that our investments make sense, given that the seas are rising, but we don't know how fast, and populations are moving around, et cetera. And so one of the, in terms of sort of the methodological approaches that we are taking, and this is sort of the fundamental basis for a lot of these decision-making under deep uncertainty methodologies that I mentioned, is using scenarios to trace out what could happen. So we make a bunch of different assumptions about sea level rise, subsidence rates, hurricane frequencies, et cetera. And then we say, okay, well, under those different scenarios, where would it make the most sense to help nourish marshland, or bolster the levee protection system, or invest in communities to elevate or flood-proof themselves. And so we do some very technical analysis to understand what would be the best combinations. And then, but the way that we then sort of account or accommodate that uncertainty is really trying to first identify, well, what are some common low regret near-term actions that everybody can generally agree on, make sense regardless of how fast the seas are rising and all the other uncertainties, and make sense given that there's so many interests on the coast. And so looking for those first initial sort of foundational no regret actions serves, that's the basis of a robust plan. And then what we do is identify, well, what trends and what conditions do we need to monitor going forward, and what would we do under, depending on how those trends unfold. And that's sort of the recipe for developing a strategy under, these types of uncertainties. And there's a lot of technical tricks to making that happen. But, what we're finding in that is that there's a big, huge role for nature-based solutions. Some of the biggest approaches or the most effective approaches for sustaining the landscape is changing the way that the Mississippi River is operated and allowing it to essentially flood and move that sediment from the river that otherwise would have been dumped off in the Gulf of Mexico, move that into the adjacent marshes. There's a lot of need for immediate risk reduction for certain communities that are really just heavily at risk, especially given the type of hurricane activity that we're seeing. And so short-term investments in floodproofing combined with targeted building up of flood control systems. And so that this sort of combination portfolio of things are really we see the most seeming to be the most effective, and also ones that the community and the state can get around. So maybe I'll pause there, see if others have follow-up questions.
That's a great overview, and it's super helpful to understand how you're approaching this, and given all the challenges that they're facing and how immediate they are. You did mention nature-based solutions as part of this, so I'd like to pivot to Anita and ask about how developed and developing countries approach flood management and the use of nature-based solutions, and where there may be similarities or differences.
Yeah, I think some similarities might be along the lines, at least what I've seen, is there's often an understandable urgency and rush to do something, to be seen to be doing something, to build something to address flood risk. And if you've just experienced a flood, or that you're at risk to one, that makes sense. But what we are trying to promote in our flood management program is to help folks to do a robust risk analysis and really understand what is the risk that they're facing as best they can, understand that, and then really be clear about what are your flood management objectives, and then go towards selecting a combination, usually, of methods to utilize for that based on your understanding of the context, which has many, many different perspectives, and we really need to take a systems approach to that. And then setting the objectives and choosing a combination of methods that speak to your objectives, getting the best design that you can for those methods, and then being really clear about the importance of monitoring the efficacy and efficiency of those methods, and then going back to the beginning to say, has our context changed? Has our risk factors changed? Do we need to update our objectives and therefore our methods? And so we're trying to move beyond sort of this linear, if I just build this seawall or this dike, then that is it and we are done, right? Because that's not often the case. So that's a similarity, that we've observed. A difference might be maybe perhaps a greater appreciation or connection in some emerging economy countries to the land and to the water and to the sea, and having a greater ability to take a historical perspective, to understand the history of that place and the role that water has placed in that history. An appreciation often that not all floods are bad. A lot of floods are natural, and they provide services that people need and depend upon. I think in developing or emerging economies, I've often seen more of a closer connection to that versus perhaps some of those of us who live in North America or Europe, where we're a little bit more often disconnected from the role that the place and the history of water in that place, has played. So I think those are important features as well.
Go ahead, Pamela. Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and maybe ask one question to Anita. So here in Puerto Rico, we have coastal wetlands and mangrove swamps, and unfortunately, some of those mangrove swamps were basically destroyed after Hurricane Maria. And these swamps are very important because they protect the neighboring coastal communities from storm surge and floods. So they're very important for the disaster resilience of the coastal communities. And the conservation of these coastal wetlands is really important. And so I think that for sustainability, the communities should also be engaged in the conservation efforts. So I just wanted to ask Anita if you've had this experience with community engagement, if you have recommendations for effectively engaging the community on this type of conservation for resilience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a fundamental, and there can be, in my view, very little risk reduction or adaptation without a robust community engagement. And there's a lot of debates about who is the community and what is the community and who gets to decide that and define it. So that's a complicated issue in and of itself. But for places where you're working, where the mangroves and other wetlands are right on the front lines and very close to the people and where they live and how safely they can live, that is key and that's fundamental. But I think it's also important to, work with those local communities, those local people, to help them understand that, yes, the protection of mangroves or the restoration in many cases of mangroves can provide those services, but of course that takes time. And how exposed are they until those mangroves live and grow and thrive? But also those systems themselves are going to have to adapt to a changing climate and to a changing system. So being able to look backwards at what we had here before and what is appropriate and possible in the future, and then make the best informed decisions we can in order to restore, recover, protect those systems in a way that is going to allow them to function the way we need and want them to into the future. And that's where I think, what this sort of panel and discussion is trying to model in terms of bringing different skill sets and disciplines and experiences together so that the local people in that place can benefit from that and learn from it, and then also contribute to it based on their decisions and what they have going forward. But we've also done a lot of work in our flood management program to help water and sanitation engineers, and a lot of times it is the engineering discipline that has decision making about water, to help them understand communities are not just something you consult or that you go out and share your plans and programs with. They need to be there at the very beginning, determining with you what is the risk here, what are our objectives, how do we move through this cycle of reducing risk and managing our water? And there's, that's a whole other topic of discussion of what methods and systems work for that. But there's a lot of work to be done to improve that, in my view.
Should I say something on that, Deb, or you want to move on?
No, go ahead. I accidentally got booted out of the meeting and just came for the discontinuity. If there's something you want to add, go ahead, and then we'll get to audience questions because we have a number of good questions coming in and not a lot of time left. Go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, this is not something that I have any particular expertise in, but it really seems to me that, in terms of kind of long-term planning and resilience, that a really important topic is going to be urban development, especially in the developing world. And, a lot of these issues of flooding, also temperature extremes, are going to be related to how much, do you have a lot of, green space in your city? Is it all asphalt? And I think, trying to promote good urban design, I think, is going to be really critical. Though I'm not good at it, but I'm glad that there are people are good. I think it's going to be important.
Well, thank you.
You're on mute, Deborah.
I had something very strange happen on my end. Can you hear me okay now? I apologize for that. Okay.
That's better.
I'm really sorry. I had a number of questions come in, and let me see if I can get this updated. They're not showing up now. One of the questions was to Pamela, and I'd like to start with one audience question, which is about the last mile and acting with and taking advantage of lessons learned and science from academia to address some of those last mile challenges. You cannot hear me?
I can hear you.
That was for Anita, right?
For Pamela.
Pamela.
And unfortunately, for some reason, here, I have my questions back. There's something strange going on my end. I really apologize. The question from the audience, this is from Maggie Favretti, is could we hear Pamela talk about new models of community engagement in Puerto Rico? Let's go with that one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so many of you mentioned the community aspect and the last mile, right? And I think, Chris, you mentioned that sometimes we have this high tech that's not getting into sometimes the people that actually need it. And so this is really important to remember in disaster resilience and also emergency response and emergency planning. So as I mentioned a little bit before, sometimes community members will be their own first responders, because after a disaster, you might have too much debris, you might have blocked roads, you might have bridges that are gone, and nobody can leave the community and nobody can come into the community. So it's really within the community that there has to be a capability to be adaptive and to respond in terms of emergency. So decentralization is very important for many aspects, including water systems, but also emergency planning, community census, community mapping, figuring out who are the most vulnerable people in my community, where are the elderly, where are the bedridden patients, where are the caregivers. So understanding who my community is and what my geography is. Understanding this by the own community members and by the own community leaders is really important, because as we understand our community, then we can plan accordingly and we can have an emergency response plan or resilience strategies that respond to my population and to my geography and to my topography. So it's really important that we support these community-led initiatives, these community-driven strategies, and that we adapt to the context. Sometimes we'll have to go low tech. Sometimes we're gonna have to go, even though we love high tech, we have to go low tech sometimes, because after a disaster, maybe we won't have power, maybe we won't have cell phone service, maybe we won't have Wi-Fi. So things like remote monitoring, maybe that's not going to work. So we really have to make sure that the strategies and the solutions that we have are really context specific. And so in terms of community involvement, there's many initiatives here in Puerto Rico that are based and focused on the communities, including things like community resilience centers. So community centers within the community that are equipped with supplies and facilities, so that in the event of a disaster, we can respond better. We have, let's say, solar power, or we have a rainwater catchment system and things like that, so that the community members can be served in the case of an emergency. But the important thing is that this is grassroots. It's not top down, right? So that the community leaders, the community members, the neighbors are the ones who are in charge. And that also makes it more sustainable, because it's no use to have a solar power system or a water tank if it only gets used during the emergency, and maybe by that time it's not well maintained, it's dirty. So it's really important that the community is the owner of these initiatives, and that way we will not only make it sustainable, we'll make sure that it's actually functioning in the moment of a disaster.
Thank you. A question came in for David about whether there's any discussion of relocation in the work that you're doing, and how that might be being thought about or managed.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it seems like an obvious solution to outsiders to relocate a community that is, very highly at risk or suffers repeated disasters. I think that, at the coast, at the statewide level, with the Louisiana master plan, for instance, there's real caution in terms of, they don't want to take a top-down approach to say, oh, well, this community is going to be relocated. That one is not, it'll get a levy, and this one is going to be okay, just the way it is. Because it's a very personal and it should be a community-oriented discussion. So, that said, there are, isolated cases where different communities have sought, funding to relocate out of harm's way, but it's not very widespread. I think the way that the state is sort of handling this is rather to say, well, what areas are there ways to reduce risk through a combination of restoration and flood proofing and structures like levees, et cetera, and then what areas are not, and then if there are communities that there really aren't any feasible way to reduce risk, then that of course opens up the discussion of, okay, well how should these people be supported in if they want to relocate. But again, there's a lot of caution about doing a top-down approach. Actually, very early on in the master planning process, there was a map that was produced with, we didn't do with dots that essentially indicated the communities that should be relocated, and it caused such an uproar, and you can understand why, because these are people's communities. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. That's just such an important point, that the decision of whether to adapt in place or relocate really has to be in the hands of the community. And it's such a personal decision, and it would be more approached from the kinds of support or incentives they might need should they decide that's the kind of thing that they want to do. So that's a really important viewpoint to have here as we think about this. We don't have a lot of time left, and unfortunately I'm not seeing all the great questions that have come in. Here somebody just posted what I think is a wonderful question and a great way to wrap up. Jillian James is asking, what mindsets are most detrimental to disaster resilience? What are recommended alternative briefs? So I'll leave that open to anybody who wants to touch on that, and as we wind down here. Okay, Anita, please.
That's a great question. I would say the mindset that's most detrimental are the ones that are fixed, and I think also one of the greatest attributes is courage, and don't let fear drive us, but let courage and excitement for a different future, as scary as it can be. I think that helps with resilience.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would just agree with what Anita has just said. And as I mentioned before, sustainability is really important. And so a way to achieve sustainability is to ask yourself not just, well, what will help us in the moment of a disaster, but more like, what can our community dream of? What can we achieve if we have, let's say, a solar power system or a rainwater catchment system? What kind of engaging projects we can create to improve our community and to also be a model to other communities? And so it's a different way of framing it, but it's much more inspiring, engaging, and it also aims towards that long-term sustainability.
Thank you. Any other?
If you don't mind restating your question, I was looking through the question Q&A list when you stated it, so I didn't catch it, sorry.
That's okay. So the question is, what mindsets are most detrimental to disaster resilience? What are recommended alternative beliefs?
Oh, okay. Well, I think we need to move away from a mindset that we understand and know and can predict where the next disaster is going to strike, or how I think we just need to be more humble in our thinking about what we know, and therefore take precautions and to ensure that we have the means to react and recover from disasters when they come.
So I'll jump in with my 2 cents, I guess. I think from a climate perspective, I think a really dangerous tendency is to take dozens of climate change simulations, average them, and say that's climate change.
Yeah.
Because that really averages out all the extremes that are within that data, and that's a really dangerous kind of background mindset to have, and a lot of people have that mindset, and under that perspective, basically nothing goes wrong, and then we get to 2050 and everybody dies, right? whereas I think if you look at the individual simulations, you see a world that's a lot like the one that we're experiencing now, where, as David says, we don't know where the next thing is going to happen, but we're sure it's going to happen somewhere. So that kind of creates a state of vigilance that we're going to need to get through this.
And if I can jump in, I'm sorry, Deb, but
I'm done.
I just think that diversity is really important, and acknowledging diversity. And so this is something that I think I would like to see more in general, disaster resilient and emergency planning, because the world is very diverse, and we have to adapt to the different populations, to the different languages that are spoken, to the different literacy levels, to the different effects that, let's say, women and men can experience, and different of people of different ages. So we really have to acknowledge diversity so that our emergency response and our disaster resilience strategies are culturally appropriate, and they are responsive to that diversity, and they are inclusive and representative.
May I just say one point building on what Pamela just said? When you part of that is also thinking about equity when you think about the investment in scarce resources for resiliency. If you just think about how do we support communities with all of the diversity that exists within that community of income, as well as all sorts of other characteristics. So this is a challenge that I think is where we're beginning to see a recognition, even at the federal level, with FEMA programs, for instance, the concept of equity has been ignored, but is now being we're looking at ways to bring it into the decision process. So I think that's a positive step.
Thank you. We might have time for just one last thought as we wind this down before we move to the chat room, and that is, in anticipation of a change in the United States administration in 2021, where we'll see a return to the Paris Agreement and opportunities for greater international collaboration. Just very quickly, what one thing would you most like to see happen to improve our disaster resilience?
Deb, I'll say from my perspective, the one thing we really need is an equal amount of attention to adaptation as well as mitigation.
Thank you. Anybody else?
The president has already indicated that one of his approaches for climate policy is going to be to, essentially, direct all governmental activities to be done with an eye towards climate change. And I think that, getting to what Anita just said, that has two sides, right? It's the mitigation, how can whatever we're doing be done in a way that reduces the carbon burden on the atmosphere, but then also how do we factor in adaptation? And so I would like to, we still are thinking about disasters in many contexts as responding to what the current risk is, not recognizing that the risks are growing over time, and we have to account for that. Otherwise, we're going to invest in areas that we shouldn't be investing in and miss out on really good big benefits. So I think I'm hopeful that those sentiments from the Biden administration, potentially future Biden administration, will permeate throughout all those activities.
I think I would just, for my 2 cents on this topic, would be to remind us that a hazard is, a combination of exposure and in some kind of climatic or weather shock. And you know, one of the things that the keynote speaker from this morning really stressed is, you know, that we can manage our water use, we can manage our resource use. And so that's one way that we can, you know, increase adaptation is just by being more efficient. And that both addresses, you know, kind of increasing exposure while also reducing our carbon footprint. So I think good old efficiency is often forgotten on the wayside. So that would be good.
And I think I would just go back to what David mentioned about equity and equitable response and resilience. What we need, I'm sorry about the barking dogs. What we need is that, again, there is representation, and when these emergency plans are being crafted, everyone has to be sitting in the table. It's like Anita mentioned, sorry about the dogs. Anita mentioned that the communities are not something to consult with. They have to be there in the beginning. Well, what I would like to see from this administration is diverse people sitting in the same table, making those decisions, drafting those plans, and real representation.
Thank you very much. I know, Laura, that we need to transition to the Zoom follow-on to this, and there are a lot of questions coming in from the community that we didn't, the audience that we didn't get to. So maybe this is a good time to make that transition.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off. So many important points being made. So thank you to all our panelists. That was a really engaging and interesting discussion. And yeah, a huge thank you to you all for your time and participation, and to our moderator, Deb, for leading us through that really great conversation. So yeah, so we'll take a 15-minute break now, and you can follow up, or around a little bit less now, 10-ish, in the break room, which I just put in the chat. So if you'd like to continue your conversations, you can do that. If you're having any technical difficulties, also visit there as well. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful discussion.
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.